In a small courtroom filled with murmurs and hushed whispers, a battle was about to unfold, one that would shock everyone who heard it. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. A woman stood at the front, her posture straight, her face filled with determination. Across from her, a man sat, his eyes lowered, his hands nervously fidgeting with the papers in front of him. Their fates, and the fate of a young child, were in the hands of the judge who had been tasked with making a decision that would change the course of their lives. The woman, in her mid-30s, had come into the courtroom with one clear demand: child support. She claimed the man, despite the brief relationship they had once shared, was the father of her child, and she needed him to contribute financially for the child's upbringing. She made her case with emotion, detailing how hard it had been raising the child on her own, how much she had sacrificed to provide for her family. Every word she spoke seemed to add weight to her argument, drawing the judge's attention and the sympathy of those in the courtroom. Her tone was firm but laced with frustration. She wanted what she felt was owed to her, what her child deserved, and she wasn't going to back down. The man, however, had a different story to tell. He didn't deny the relationship they once had, but he vehemently denied that he was the father of her child. His eyes darted nervously from the woman to the judge, trying to keep his composure under the weight of the accusation. He explained how he had doubts from the beginning, unsure if the child was truly his. As he spoke, the room grew quiet, hanging on every word he said. He didn't want to be caught in something he hadn't signed up for. He wanted to prove his innocence, to clear his name before it was too late. The judge listened intently, his expression stoic and unreadable. He had seen cases like this before, cases of paternity disputes, of financial obligations that people try to escape from. But something about this case was different. There was a level of complexity to it, a story behind the people standing before him. He knew the decision he was about to make could set a precedent, and it could change their lives forever. But the evidence was clear, and his mind seemed to be working overdrive, weighing all the details of the case. The judge looked between the woman and the man, his gavel resting in front of him. The decision was on the horizon. The courtroom was still, with only the sound of a ticking clock breaking the silence. It was clear that both sides had their reasons, but who would the judge believe? Would he side with the woman who was desperate for financial support? Or would he take the man's word, doubting the child's paternity? The next few moments would decide everything. Then the judge did something no one expected. With a calm yet assertive tone, he began to speak. His words weren't what anyone in the courtroom had been anticipating. Instead of simply ruling on the child support case, the judge dug deeper. He questioned the woman's motives, asking how certain she was about the paternity of the child. He asked if there was more to this story, if there was something hidden beneath the surface that hadn't come to light. His questions pierced through the tension in the room, leaving everyone wondering what he would say next. The man, though still nervous, seemed to sense an opening. He spoke up again, adding more details about his life, about the woman's behavior during their brief relationship. He painted a picture of the situation that painted him as the victim in this case. His words weren't harsh, but they were firm, trying to sway the judge's opinion in his favor. It was a game of words, a contest of who could tell the most convincing story. But even as he spoke, the woman did not flinch. She stood her ground, eyes locked onto the judge, her determination unwavering. Then came the twist. The judge turned to the woman, his expression serious but not unkind. "Before I make my decision, there's one thing I need to know," he said, his voice carrying across the room. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for him to speak the next words that would make or break the case. "Have you had a paternity test done?" His question was simple, but it carried so much weight. In that moment, everything seemed to freeze. The woman hesitated. It was a small pause, but it was enough for everyone to notice. She hadn't expected this question. In her rush to secure her claim, to demand what she believed was owed, she hadn't anticipated that the judge would challenge the very foundation of her case. The man, now sensing an opportunity, looked up at her. His face was filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. Could this whole thing have been a misunderstanding? Could he have been dragged into a battle he never should have been a part of? The woman's response, or lack thereof, sent shockwaves through the room. She had not anticipated the judge's line of questioning, and now the entire case was thrown into uncertainty. What would happen next? Would the judge rule in her favor, or would the man's doubt be the deciding factor? The courtroom seemed to lean forward, waiting for an answer that might change everything. But the answer never came. Instead, the judge, his face grave, leaned back in his chair. "I'll need time to consider all the evidence before making my decision," he announced, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "We'll reconvene in 1 week." With that, the gavel struck, and the courtroom was filled with murmurs. The woman's face, once filled with resolve, now seemed to falter. The man's expression was hard to read, as if a cloud of uncertainty had gathered over him. As the two of them left the courtroom, their lives still hanging in the balance, everyone was left wondering what would happen next. Would the woman's demand for child support be granted, or would the man's doubts about the child's paternity be enough to sway the judge's decision? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The judge's verdict was far from the end of this story. It was just the beginning of a much larger and more complicated journey that no one in that room could have predicted. And so the question lingered in the air, unresolved. What would happen when they returned to court in a week? Would the truth finally come out, or would it remain buried beneath layers of doubt and uncertainty? The waiting was unbearable, and everyone in the courtroom was left with the same thought. This was far from over. The next chapter would reveal more than anyone could have anticipated. The week leading up to this second hearing felt like an eternity for both the woman and the man involved. They each carried the weight of uncertainty, but their paths were vastly different. The woman found herself alone in her apartment late at night, replaying the events of the courtroom over and over in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. She had entered the case full of confidence, believing that the judge would see her side and that the man would be held accountable. She had done everything right, worked hard, raised her child alone, and now all she wanted was a little help. But that question, that one simple question from the judge about a paternity test, had thrown her off balance. She paced back and forth in her living room, grappling with the thought that her whole argument might unravel. Had she really been so sure about everything? Had she really known the truth? The woman's mind was flooded with doubt. What if the man wasn't the father after all? What if she had been wrong all along? She had known him. She had trusted him. At least, that's what she had believed back then. But now, everything felt uncertain. Meanwhile, the man was dealing with his own set of emotions. After the first hearing, he spent hours at home in silence, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His mind kept returning to the judge's question. He had never anticipated that simple question would open the floodgates to everything he'd been trying to avoid. The doubt that had been simmering beneath the surface for years now felt like a weight he couldn't escape. He had always known that there was something off about the situation, but hearing the judge ask if a paternity test had been done made everything feel so much more real. Was he about to be tied to a child that wasn't his? Was he about to face years of responsibility for something he wasn't even sure he had a part in creating? There was a knot in his stomach every time he thought about the situation. He had tried to be there for the woman when she first told him about the pregnancy, but it was always a complicated situation. They hadn't been together long, and their relationship had never been stable. They had ended things months ago, and he had tried to move on with his life. But now, this demand for child support had come back to haunt him. It felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Both of them spent the days leading up to the second hearing in a state of tension, trying to prepare themselves for what was to come. The courtroom was once again filled with an air of expectancy as the second hearing began. This time, however, the room was even more crowded. News had spread about the dramatic developments of the first session, and people were curious to see how things would play out. The judge entered the room, his expression unchanged, and everyone grew quiet. The woman stood up, her eyes focused on the judge as he took his seat. She had rehearsed her words, prepared herself for this moment, but something in her gut told her that the final ruling would be different this time. She had spent the last few days trying to gather everything she could to prove the man's responsibility. She had gone through medical records, tried to find people who could corroborate her claims, and even contacted a lawyer who told her to stay firm, to hold her ground. But with every passing moment, the uncertainty gnawed at her. The man sat quietly across from her, his hands still fidgeting with the papers in front of him. His nerves were clearly visible. He had avoided discussing the situation with anyone, preferring to keep things to himself. The people around him didn't understand what he was going through, didn't realize the gravity of the situation. They saw him as the man who might just get away with it, but the truth was far more complicated. Every time the woman looked at him, she saw a person who didn't believe her, and every time he looked at her, he saw someone who had put him in this position. As the judge began to speak, everyone in the room leaned forward. The words that followed were even more unexpected than before. The judge didn't give a final verdict right away. Instead, he raised another question that no one had seen coming. He wanted to know more about the child's upbringing, about the woman's situation. He wanted to know how much she had been involved in the child's life, how much she had really done for her. His questions seemed to be veering into territory no one had prepared for. The focus seemed to shift from the man's responsibility to the woman's credibility. It was as if the judge was peeling back the layers of a much larger story, one that involved more than just a financial obligation. The woman was caught off guard. She hadn't expected this line of questioning. She had thought the case was about the man's role in the child's life, not hers. But now she found herself defending her actions. She spoke about her efforts to raise the child on her own, how difficult it had been without help. She mentioned the sacrifices she had made, the long hours working to provide, all the while keeping the child's best interests at heart. She even mentioned the pain of being alone in this journey, the isolation that came with doing everything herself. But the judge wasn't satisfied. He seemed to be searching for something deeper, something beyond the surface level of their arguments. The man, feeling increasingly uncomfortable, tried to explain himself again. He spoke about how the child had come into his life unexpectedly, how the relationship with the woman had never been stable. He didn't want to be caught in a situation that wasn't his fault. But even as he spoke, he felt a growing sense of guilt. There were moments when he had been there for the woman, when he had tried to help, but those moments seemed lost now. The more he spoke, the more the judge seemed to pick apart his reasons for hesitating. The courtroom grew tense as the judge paused, staring down at his papers, as if weighing something heavy. The woman and the man exchanged fleeting glances, but neither of them knew what the other was thinking. It felt like they were trapped in an endless cycle of words, each one designed to defend their positions, to justify their actions. Neither of them seemed to be getting closer to a resolution. And then the judge did something that completely shifted the direction of the case. He turned to the woman and asked if she had ever considered the possibility that she might be mistaken about the paternity of the child. The question hit her like a ton of bricks. It was the last thing she had expected. The man had already denied being the father, but now the judge was questioning her certainty, challenging everything she had built her case on. She froze, the room going silent around her. Her heart raced as she tried to find her voice, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Could it be? Could she have been wrong? The idea that she might not know the truth, that she might have been mistaken, was more terrifying than anything she had faced in her life. And in that moment, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The judge's words hung in the air, and everyone in the room waited for her response. Would she admit to the possibility of being wrong, or would she double down on her position? The tension was unbearable. The man, who had been so quiet up until now, shifted in his seat, sensing that the woman's next words could change everything. The silence that filled the courtroom after the judge's question felt suffocating. Everyone seemed to hold their breath as they waited for the woman's response. Her face had drained of color, her mind spinning as if she had just been hit with a revelation she wasn't prepared for. Could she have been wrong? Could it be possible that the man, despite all the signs, wasn't the father? She had never allowed herself to entertain that thought. But now, sitting under the weight of the judge's piercing gaze, the idea crept into her mind. Her eyes flickered toward the man. He sat there, tense, his jaw tight, waiting for her answer. The way he looked at her, a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope, only made the moment more unbearable. Had she really been so sure? Had she built her entire case on something she wasn't entirely certain about? She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out. She wanted to say something strong, to defend herself, to insist that she was right. But the doubt planted by the judge's question continued to grow. Her hands trembled slightly, and she could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her. The judge, the man, the people watching from the gallery. They were all waiting for her to make her next move. The room seemed to close in on her as the seconds ticked by, stretching into what felt like an eternity. The judge leaned forward slightly, as if trying to gauge her thoughts. "You don't have to answer immediately," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "But understand this. This decision will affect more than just you. It will affect the child. It will affect the man sitting across from you. It will affect everyone in this room. So I need you to be certain. I need you to be honest." The woman swallowed hard. The pressure was immense, more than she had ever felt in her life. She had fought so hard for this moment, for this case, believing she was in the right. She had believed her son deserved financial support, that the man was responsible for the life he had helped create, even if it had been brief. But now, the judge was casting doubt on everything she had built her case on. What if the truth was more complicated than she had realized? The man, who had been so quiet, shifted in his seat. He seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps for the woman to admit that she had been wrong, or perhaps for the confirmation he had longed for, proof that he wasn't the father. He glanced at the woman, and in that brief moment, she saw something in his eyes. Uncertainty. It was as though he was waiting for the moment when the truth would finally be revealed, no matter how painful it might be. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice shaky but resolute. "I'm certain," she said, the words coming out more forcefully than she had expected. "I've always been certain. He is the father." The room seemed to exhale collectively, but the judge remained unmoved, his eyes fixed on her with a steady, unwavering gaze. But the doubt that had crept into her mind remained, gnawing at her as the judge continued to observe her. "Are you certain?" he asked again, this time more insistently. "What if you've been mistaken? What if the man you've believed to be the father isn't? Have you truly considered the possibility that you might not know?" The woman's chest tightened. The weight of his words pressed down on her. How could she have considered something she didn't want to face? She had built her life around the idea that the man was responsible. She had lived with that certainty for so long that the very thought of it being wrong felt like a crushing blow. But the judge's words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over. What if she was wrong? The man sat there, watching her with an intensity that made it impossible to ignore. He had no answers for her, no comfort to offer. He could only wait and hope that the truth would finally come to light, whatever that truth might be. The courtroom was now a battlefield, a place where no one seemed to have control over the outcome. The woman's mind raced. She remembered the early days, the moments when they had first found out she was pregnant. The excitement, the plans they had made, the promises they had exchanged. But then the relationship had fractured, and everything had changed. Now, looking back, she realized how little she truly knew about the man, how little they had truly known each other. Their relationship had always been on shaky ground, filled with miscommunication, misunderstandings, and broken promises. Could it be that she had misread everything? Could it be that the man wasn't the father after all? She turned her gaze back to him, watching the way he avoided her eyes, his face closed off. There was a wall between them now, one that hadn't been there before. It was as if they had become strangers, each trying to hold on to their own version of the truth. The man had always been distant, but now he seemed even more so, retreating further into himself. She couldn't read him, couldn't tell if he was relieved or upset. She didn't know what he was feeling, and that uncertainty terrified her. The judge, sensing the turmoil in the room, didn't let the silence stretch on too long. He stood up, his voice cutting through the tension. "We will reconvene in 2 days," he announced, his words final. "That will give you both time to reflect, time to gather any evidence that might clarify the truth." With that, he banged his gavel, signaling the end of the session. But as everyone began to rise and leave the courtroom, the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it only intensified. The woman left the room with her head held high, but inside, her thoughts were spinning. She had thought she was so sure, so certain, but now she wasn't so sure anymore. What if the truth was more complicated than she had imagined? Outside the courtroom, the man walked silently, his mind racing as well. He had been waiting for this moment, for this clarity, but now that it was so close, it felt like he was caught in a storm of uncertainty. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The questions that had been lingering in his mind, the doubts about the child's paternity, had all been magnified by the judge's words. And the worst part was that he didn't know if he would ever get the closure he was seeking. Both of them were left with the same question: what was the truth? And now, with the deadline looming, they had no choice but to wait, hoping that somehow the truth would come to light. Would the woman be proven right, or would the man finally be free of the responsibility he had been so desperately trying to avoid? The clock was ticking, and the answer was still out of reach. 2 days passed, and the courtroom reconvened with an even more palpable sense of anticipation. The woman arrived early, her heart beating in her chest as she walked through the halls of the courthouse. She hadn't slept the night before, her mind racing with possibilities. What if the judge had found something in the case she hadn't seen? What if the man wasn't the father? And if that was true, what did that mean for her? Could she still fight for child support without the paternity being confirmed? What if the truth came crashing down and destroyed everything she had believed? She walked into the courtroom, trying to steady her nerves, but her thoughts kept spiraling. The man hadn't shown up yet, and she couldn't help but wonder if he was feeling just as uncertain as she was. His silence in the past few days only made her question his intentions more. Was he relieved that he might not be the father, or was he dreading the results of the paternity test? The judge entered the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Without hesitation, he gestured for both parties to sit down, his face more serious than it had been before. The tension in the room thickened as everyone took their places. This was it, the moment of reckoning. The judge cleared his throat and began speaking, but there was something different about his tone this time. He wasn't just addressing the case at hand. There was an undercurrent of something far more complex in his voice. "We've all had time to reflect on the situation," he began, his gaze sweeping over the woman and the man. "But before we proceed, there is something important that has come to light." A hush fell over the courtroom. The woman's stomach tightened with unease. What could possibly have changed in just 2 days? She exchanged a quick glance with the man, but his expression remained unreadable. The judge continued, "It has come to our attention that there was a significant oversight in the documents submitted by the woman," he said, his voice calm but firm. The woman felt a cold chill run down her spine. What did he mean by oversight? Had she made a mistake? The judge paused for a moment before speaking again. "It appears that the original birth certificate provided by the woman has discrepancies in the recorded father's information. It wasn't initially flagged during the initial hearings, but now we have reason to believe that the details may have been altered." The woman's world seemed to tilt as she absorbed the impact of the judge's words. Her mind raced. Discrepancies, altered details. How could that even be possible? She had never tampered with any documents. Everything she had submitted was truthful, wasn't it? The idea that her own papers might be questioned, That something so foundational to her case could now be seen as questionable sent her into a state of shock. The man across from her shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes now narrowed, studying her with suspicion. He hadn't expected this either. His expression had changed, and there was a new intensity in his gaze. Was he beginning to piece something together? Was he starting to doubt her? The judge continued, explaining that there had been a review of the birth certificate in the past 48 hours, and they had uncovered some disturbing details. The mother's signature, which was supposed to match the one on file with the hospital, appeared to be inconsistent. There was no explanation for the discrepancy. The judge didn't say it outright, but the implication was clear. Someone had manipulated the records. The woman's heart raced. She had never, in her wildest dreams, imagined that such an accusation would be thrown at her. The room felt as if it were closing in on her, the air thick with tension. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but her throat had gone dry. How could she explain something she didn't understand herself? She had always been so careful, so meticulous in her actions, yet now it seemed that every step she had taken was being questioned. The man, for the first time since the beginning of the case, spoke up. "This doesn't make any sense," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "I didn't even know about any of this. I've been trying to figure out why all this is happening. But now, this. Why didn't you tell me about this, if you're sure he's mine?" The woman's chest tightened as his words hit her like a physical blow. His voice was filled with a mixture of anger and confusion, but there was something else, something that sounded like betrayal. She had never lied about the paternity, never intentionally misled him. But now, with the judge's revelations, everything was being turned on its head. How could she explain that she had no idea how this had happened? How could she tell him that she had trusted the paperwork and trusted the system, only for it to fail her now? The judge observed them for a moment before speaking again, his tone heavy with authority. "It's crucial that we understand how these discrepancies occurred," he said. "Was this a mistake, or was there intent behind it? Either way, it changes the context of the case entirely. Until we have more clarity on this, I cannot proceed with a decision regarding child support or paternity." The room seemed to hold its breath, every single person present caught in the same web of uncertainty. The woman's thoughts were a blur as she tried to process what was happening. She had no explanation for the altered records. She had always believed the birth certificate was accurate. Could someone have tampered with it behind her back? Or had she been deceived herself? And if she had been deceived, who could she trust now? The man across from her seemed like the last person she could turn to for answers. Their relationship, once filled with potential, had unraveled in a way she hadn't expected. His doubt was written all over his face now, and she couldn't blame him for it. How could he possibly believe her when it seemed like her own story was falling apart? The judge, seemingly aware of the chaos his revelations had caused, stood up, signaling the end of the session for the day. "This matter will require further investigation," he said, his voice firm but compassionate. "We will reconvene in 2 weeks. In the meantime, I suggest that both parties reconsider their positions and take the time to reflect on the gravity of the situation. We need the truth, and we will get to the bottom of this, one way or another." As the courtroom began to empty, the woman felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. The path ahead seemed impossible to navigate. Was she really at fault? Had she made a grave mistake without realizing it? The man stood up slowly, his face hardening as he prepared to leave. He didn't look at her, didn't say anything as he walked toward the exit. The woman remained seated, her hands shaking as she tried to grasp the full extent of what had just happened. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to figure out the truth. She had no idea what that truth was anymore. 2 weeks had passed, and the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The woman sat in the same seat as before, but everything had changed. The judge had ordered further investigation, and in the time that had elapsed, the truth was beginning to unfold in ways neither she nor the man had expected. The man entered the courtroom first, his face still carrying that hint of uncertainty, But something was different today. He seemed calmer, more composed, as though he had come to terms with the reality of what was about to unfold. The woman could feel the weight of his presence across the room, and she wondered if he, too, had been reflecting on everything that had happened. The tension between them had never been more apparent, yet somehow, the distance between them seemed to have grown even wider. The judge entered the room, his eyes sharp as he surveyed the scene. He wasted no time in getting to the point. "We've gathered the results of the investigation," he said, his voice grave. The woman's stomach twisted. It felt like a final verdict was about to be delivered, and the uncertainty of what that would be was unbearable. "We've reviewed the birth certificate once again," the judge continued, "and we've also conducted further paternity tests. What we found is both unexpected and clarifying." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The woman's hands clenched on the table in front of her, her heart pounding in her chest. The man's gaze flickered briefly toward her, but he said nothing. The birth certificate, the judge said, was indeed altered, but not by the woman. He turned his eyes toward the man, who stiffened at the revelation. "It appears that someone else tampered with the records after the child's birth. The hospital system was breached. But it wasn't the mother who made the changes. It was the father." The words hit like a slap in the face. The woman's breath caught in her throat as she struggled to comprehend what the judge had just said. The father. But the man sitting across from her, the one she had thought was responsible for everything, had been innocent all along. Her mind reeled as the reality of the situation settled in. The man's eyes widened, and for the first time since the case began, he seemed genuinely shaken. "I didn't," the man began, his voice cracking as he looked at the judge. Then at the woman. "I didn't know anything about that. I swear. I didn't touch any documents." The judge raised a hand, signaling for him to calm down. "The truth is, it wasn't an intentional act by you, but it was your name that was linked to the tampered records. And while you may not have been the one to alter them, the results of the paternity test reveal that you are, in fact, not the father of this child." The woman's head spun as the judge's words sank in. The paternity test, the one she had clung to for so long, the one that had driven her case, had come back negative. The man wasn't the father. The man who had been sitting across from her, whose name had been written in her mind as the father, wasn't the one who had fathered her child. The shock was overwhelming. She turned her gaze to the man, her mouth dry. "What does this mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man shook his head slowly, still processing the bombshell that had been dropped. "I don't know," he said, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. "This wasn't supposed to happen. I never asked for this." The judge's gaze softened, but his tone remained firm. "The records were altered by a third party, someone with access to the hospital system. We've traced the changes back to an external source. There's more to this story than you both know." The room fell into a heavy silence as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The woman's mind raced. Who could have done this? Who could have tampered with the records and set everything in motion in such a devastating way? Then the judge stood up and motioned for the woman to approach the bench. She did so reluctantly, her legs shaky beneath her as she moved toward him. The man stayed where he was, his eyes never leaving her as she stood before the judge. "Listen carefully," the judge said, his voice low but intense. "There's more that you need to know. The person who altered the records wasn't a stranger to either of you. The truth is, it was someone you both know." The woman's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling. The judge's next words sent a chill through her body. "It was your ex-husband, the biological father of your child. He's the one who changed the birth certificate, and he's the one who orchestrated this entire situation." The woman's knees nearly buckled as the shock of the revelation hit her like a freight train. Her ex-husband, the man she had thought was long out of her life, the father of her child, had deliberately tampered with the paternity records, setting this entire chain of events into motion. Her ex-husband had engineered this entire situation to make it appear as though the other man was responsible. Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned to the man sitting across the room. His face had drained of color, his expression one of utter disbelief. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know any of this." "I know," she said, her voice shaking. "I had no idea either. I was just as much a pawn in this as you were." The courtroom seemed to stand still as the truth finally came into focus. Her ex-husband, for reasons that still weren't fully clear, had wanted to create chaos in her life. He had manipulated the situation from the start, feeding her false information and using the system to his advantage. And now, all of it had come crashing down. The judge's final words hung in the air like a weight. "We will notify law enforcement about the fraudulent activity and the tampered records. Your ex-husband will be investigated, and you will have the chance to pursue legal action. But for now, the case is dismissed." As the judge brought the gavel down, the room erupted into whispers. The woman felt numb as she sat back down, her mind still reeling. The man looked at her one last time, his expression softening as he seemed to grasp the enormity of what had happened. There were no words left between them. The conflict had been resolved, but in a way that neither of them had ever expected. As they both left the courtroom, the weight of the truth finally settling in, the woman realized that her life was far from over. The twists of fate had brought her here, and while this chapter had come to a close, she couldn't help but wonder what the next twist would be. And in that moment, she understood something. This was just the beginning. As the days passed after the trial, the woman felt as though she were waking from a nightmare. The shock of the courtroom revelation still lingered, but she was slowly piecing her life back together. The discovery of her ex-husband's involvement had shattered everything she thought she knew about the situation. It was a betrayal unlike anything she could have imagined. The man she had trusted, the one who had once promised to stand by her side, had become the architect of her pain. The woman's mind often wandered back to those first days after the birth, when everything had seemed so simple. But now, those days felt like a distant memory, a time when she had been naive and unaware of the forces at play. Her ex-husband's betrayal didn't just stop with the tampered birth certificate. He had caused chaos in her life in ways she hadn't even realized. As the investigation continued, law enforcement uncovered a network of manipulations. He had been behind the false information, the emotional manipulation, and even the financial pressure she had been under. It turned out he had used his connections to make sure that every move she made was met with opposition. The fact that he had orchestrated this entire mess only to make her life harder was something she still couldn't fully comprehend. The woman found herself facing a new reality. She had to rebuild her trust in others, and perhaps more importantly, in herself. She was no longer the person she had been before all of this began. But with the truth now out in the open, she also realized that she was stronger than she had known. She had survived the emotional roller coaster, the doubts, the fears, and the judgment from others. She had endured, and now she was reclaiming control of her life. The man she had been involved with, the one who had stood trial alongside her, had not disappeared from the picture. After the case, he approached her with a sense of quiet understanding. He didn't blame her for what had happened. He understood that she, too, had been misled. It wasn't his fault, nor was it hers. It had been a series of tragic misunderstandings, and in the end, neither of them had truly been in control of their own lives. They sat together one afternoon, both of them looking at the mess that had been made, trying to make sense of it all. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice full of regret. "I should have believed you from the start. I should have trusted you." The woman shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "I should have trusted myself more. I let myself get lost in the lies, and I didn't see what was really going on. But we can't change the past. We can only move forward." There was a long pause between them, but it was a peaceful one. They didn't have to say much more. The understanding was there. They had both learned valuable lessons through this ordeal, lessons that would shape their future choices and relationships. As for her ex-husband, the woman knew that the legal process would eventually catch up with him. His involvement in the fraud would not go unpunished, but there was a part of her that felt a strange kind of closure. The truth had come out. She had faced the chaos, the emotional turmoil, and the uncertainty. But she had come through it, standing stronger, wiser, and more resilient than before. With the legal battles behind her, the woman began to focus on her child. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to create a life of stability, one that would be filled with love, trust, and honesty. She knew that as a mother, she would do whatever it took to provide the best possible future for her child, even if that meant facing more difficult days ahead. She had already proven to herself that she could weather the storm. Meanwhile, the man who had been involved in the case had made his own decisions about where to go from there. He knew that the past was behind them, and he had no intention of dragging her back into it. His involvement in the situation had been accidental, but he had gained an understanding of what it meant to trust and to be trusted. He wasn't looking for anything more than the chance to move on, to live a life free from the lies and complications that had surrounded him for so long. As the months passed, the woman found a sense of peace. She moved to a new city, away from the memories of the courtroom and the heartache it had brought. She started fresh, building new connections and pursuing her passions with a renewed sense of purpose. There was something freeing about finally having control of her own story. The mistakes, the struggles, and the pain had all been part of her journey, but they no longer defined her. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, she realized how far she had come. It had been a long, difficult road, but she had come out on the other side, stronger, more self-aware, and more determined than ever. She was no longer a victim of the circumstances, but the author of her own life. Her child, now growing older, played in the yard, oblivious to the complex history that had led them to this moment. The woman smiled softly, her heart full of love and pride. No matter what had happened before, this was her future now. And as the final rays of sunlight bathed the world in golden light, she knew that whatever came next, she was ready for it. The storm had passed, and the calm had settled in. In the end, the key takeaway from everything that had transpired was this: sometimes the hardest battles lead to the greatest strength. The woman had been tested in ways she never imagined, and through it all, she had proven her resilience. Trust had been shattered, but through truth and perseverance, it could be rebuilt. Life would never be the same, but it didn't have to be perfect. It only had to be real. And now, that's exactly what she had. A life that was her own, built from the ground up, free from the lies of the past. The future was bright, and the woman was finally in control.